The Stayf Comic Ink Brushes. The Stayf Comic Ink Brushes are made to use in Procreate. In the brush set are 14 brushes based on traditional Sable brushes, quill pens, dip pens and fineliners. With this set you can ink in any comic style you want. I studied the characteristics of the analog brushes and pens and translated them into digital brushes. Stayf Ink Sable. This is my go-to ink brush if I want to ink comics with thick and thin lines. The brush has a tiny bleed to give it an analog feel, and it's tapered to draw with a variety of strokes. This brush is inspired by the Winsor & Newton series 7 Sable brushes number 1 and number 2 I used to ink with when I was inking comics on paper. Stayf Ink Taper Smooth. This ink brush is for inking with smooth strokes, to ink in a more commercial style. The brush is tapered and has a built-in stabilization to easily ink smooth lines and curves. Stayf Ink Bleed. The Stayf Ink Bleed is a structured ink brush. The ink bleeds into the paper, creating a more organic effect. You can ink with thick and thin lines, because it's a round brush. Stayf Ink Dry Scatter. This brush is the most structured ink brush in the brush set. It's a scattered brush with a random feel to it. It's great for working in a dry brush style. You can also use this brush for gradual ink effects in your inks. This brush is a combination of two brushes to achieve the analog feel of inking with a real dry brush on paper. Stayf Ink Dry. The Stayf Ink Dry is the same brush as the scatter version, but with this brush you have more control over your line art. It's great to add some dry brush effects to your inks or ink in a dry brush technique. Stayf Dry Ink. This is also a dry ink brush, but with a different texture. You can ink your characters or backgrounds with it, and also use thick and thin lines. When you press harder, the brush provides more ink. Stayf Quill Taper. The quill is one of the oldest dip pens illustrators and cartoonists like T.S. Sullivan and George Herriman used to create their art. It is still used today. This is a tapered ink pen. When you pull it away or towards you, the stroke begins with a thin stroke that ends in a thicker end. It is great for inking fine lines and cross-hatching. Stayf Dip Pen. The Stayf Dip Pen is great for inking vintage illustrations in the style of Ernest Shepard, who drew and inked Winnie the Pooh. This brush has some transparency and grit. It's perfect for inking in a more sketchy way. The pen has a slight taper and is great for cross-hatching. Stayf Dip Pen 102. The Dip Pen 102 is the most used dip pen by illustrators and comic artists. When you ink slowly, you can get a perfect line. When you ink faster, the pen has a bit of a grit. The ink that you lay down is a bit wet. When you cross-hatch with this 102, it pulls the ink, creating a natural ink effect, like you're inking on paper. Stayf Fineliner 0.25. In this Stayf Comic Ink brush set, you find 4 fineliners with different widths. The fineliners have a fixed point and are great for inking in a flat style, like 1010. You can also use them for inking the borders of your panel. So in this set you have the 0.25, 0.5, 1mm and 2mm fineliner. Stayf Calligraphy Letter. This calligraphy pen is perfect for lettering balloons. Perpendicular the strokes are thin and horizontally they are fat. You can letter standard fonts and bold fonts with it. This calligraphy pen is inspired by the comic lettering of Walt Kelly, who drew Pogo. Buy this brush set now and import it into Procreate and start inking.